One of Apache's features is virtual hosting, which is the ability to serve content from multiple domains using the same server. Shared web hosting is the most common place to find this type of configuration, as it's very cost-effective to be able to serve content from multiple domains from the same server rather than setting up an entire server for each domain. Apache provides two types of virtual hosting. Name-based virtual hosting routes requests based on the domain name supplied by the client, which is usually the browser. This is the easiest kind of virtual hosting to implement, but presents challenges for SSL as the server doesn't know which certificate to be using. In contrast, IP-based virtual hosting requires a separate IP address for every site. This solves the SSL certificate problem, but is more cost-prohibitive and has more technical overhead. With this context, let's go back and take a look at the configuration for the Alice site. Switch back to the terminal. I'm going to use cat to display the entire contents of the Alice configuration. So that configuration is found in etc. Apache 2 sites-available alice.conf. The very first line is a directive indicating that this is a configuration for a virtual host. Notice that it's contained in a less than and greater than symbol, which means that anything in those symbols is enclosed or belongs to this directive. The argument is 10.0.2.15:80. This is an IP-based virtual host. In case you were wondering, the IP is a default assigned by VirtualBox to the guest operating system. Depending on the configuration, this can also be a fully qualified domain name, or FQDN, but this isn't recommended according to the Apache configuration. The :80 indicates that this configuration is only listening on port 80. The next directive is for server admin, which sets the contact address that is used for error messages returned to the client. If the server is using custom error messages and isn't exposing contact information, this configuration isn't necessary. Server name, on the other hand, is usually very important. This is typically set system-wide, but virtual hosts should explicitly set this value as well, as it uniquely identifies name-based virtual hosts. This is typically the fully qualified domain name of the server. In this case, it's alice.example.com. The directory also encloses a set of configuration, and the argument is the directory path. In this case, it's /serve/web, which contains the Alice HTML. The next three lines are directives for permissions. The first two, order, controls the default access site and defines the order in which allow and deny directives are evaluated. In this case, access is allowed from all. Instead of all, the directive could be a specific hostname, IP address, or even an environmental variable. These directives are in the older Apache configuration style and are deprecated in version 2.4, but I've included them as they're extremely common and provided by default for compatibility. The final directive, require all granted, is part of the Apache 2.4 permission system. This directive indicates that all users are granted access unconditionally. This closes the directory configuration. Without it, Apache doesn't know what the permissions are and won't serve content from the directory. Finally, the document root. Again, this is the directory from which Apache will be serving files. At the very bottom, the virtual host directive is closed out, and that's the end of the file. Now that we've seen a configuration file, there's a trick for testing the configuration. This is particularly useful when making changes and checking to see whether or not there were any syntax errors. I'm going to use Apache CTL again, but this time with the option -t. We haven't made any changes and the configuration is working, so syntax OK seems logical. The -t option has another twist though. It can describe all virtual hosts configured. So Apache CTL space -t -D dump _vhosts. This is extremely helpful. I get an explicit list of all the virtual hosts, how they're defined, the server name, and even the file and line where the configuration starts. Let's update the worksheet with our new information. There are two primary types of virtual hosts, name-based and IP-based. Alice is clearly IP-based. The address for the virtual host is 10.0.2.15 on port 80, the default HTTP port. Finally, the server name for the virtual host is alice.example.com. This is good to know, especially if there will be any redirects. At this point, we've got a good overview of how the configuration can tell the server how to run. But what if you want to change the capabilities of the server?